At first, it looked like one more formal family portrait from the 1890s. A father in a dark suit, a mother standing stiffly beside him, two boys trying very hard not to move. A little girl in a serious dress with her hand set just right for the camera. The whole thing had that familiar old photo feeling, the kind that makes people glance at it, nod once, and move on. Another family, another frozen room, another piece of the past that seems finished. But this one wasn't finished. Because on the floor, tucked so carefully you could miss it even when you were looking straight at it, was a small cloth doll. And that doll turned out to be the key to a story nobody had spoken out loud for more than a century. In the winter of 2023, Amelia Hart, a curator at a historical archive in Providence, Rhode Island, was working through a batch of donated photographs from a collector's estate. It was the kind of day curators know too well. Hours of sorting, dry eyes, cold coffee, old cardstock, fading ink, gloved hands, and a stack of images that all start to blur together after the first 100 faces. Most donation boxes hold almost nothing dramatic. They matter, sure, but quietly. A wedding portrait, a baby cabinet card, somebody's aunt on somebody's porch. History usually survives in ordinary fragments. Then Amelia pulled out one mounted family portrait and stopped. The studio imprint at the bottom read Alden and Pierce Studio, Providence, 1891. The photograph was unusually sharp. Even before magnification, she could see the texture of the father's jacket, the lace at the mother's collar, the polished wood grain of the chair. It was a good studio, a careful photographer, and a family that had paid for quality. 5 figures, posed with that rigid precision people used when photographs were expensive enough to matter. She studied the group the way specialists do, almost without thinking. The father appeared to be in his late 30s. The mother stood beside him, face composed, one hand resting near the shoulder of the little girl. The boys stood slightly apart, their boots angled neatly, their hair combed down hard. It was all perfectly proper. Then her eyes dropped toward the carpet. There, partly hidden beneath the edge of a patterned rug and shadowed by the carved leg of the chair, sat a small rag doll. Not posed in the hands of a child, not displayed proudly like a prized toy, just there. Present, but not announced. Visible, but barely. It looked worn, handmade, and loved. The kind of doll stitched in a kitchen rather than bought in a fancy shop. And the more Amelia stared at it, the stranger it felt. Because families didn't spend money on a formal portrait in 1891 and then accidentally leave a toy on the floor. That simply was not how those photographs worked. Studio portraits in that era were controlled almost to the inch. Clothing, posture, props, hand placement, backdrops, everything had intention. If a Bible appeared, it meant something. If a watch showed, it meant something. If a child held a toy, that too could mean something. But a worn homemade doll tucked near the edge of the frame, where it could almost disappear, that did not read like carelessness. It read like a message. Amelia scanned the image at a resolution most people would call excessive and zoomed in on the doll until the fabric threads sharpened. The doll's little dress was plain. The yarn hair was frayed. One seam along the torso looked clumsy, as if it had been repaired by hand more than once. It wasn't just a toy, it was a possession that had lasted. And suddenly, Amelia had 2 questions she couldn't shake. Why was the doll there? And why had somebody wanted it recorded without drawing attention to it? The studio register led her to names by the next morning. The appointment book showed a sitting from October 1891 for Henry and Clara Bennett, family portrait, 5 subjects, paid in full. That gave her the adults. The city directory placed Henry Bennett in Providence and listed him as a mill overseer. So far, nothing odd. Respectable, upward-moving, exactly the kind of household that would want a portrait proving stability. Then the records bent sideways. Birth registries showed only 2 sons born to Henry and Clara Bennett, Samuel in 1883, Edwin in 1885. No daughter, no 3rd child, no little girl anywhere in the official family record. Amelia checked again because that sort of problem is usually human error before it becomes mystery. But no. The portrait clearly showed 3 children, and the records clearly showed only 2 sons. That little girl in the photograph had no legal place in the family on paper. Now the doll looked less like decoration and more like evidence. Amelia followed Henry Bennett into employment records and found what she needed in a place that almost felt too cruel to be coincidence. Henry had worked at the Blackstone River textile mill in Pawtucket before moving into a supervisory role. Inside a folder of clipped notices and labour summaries from 1890, she found coverage of a deadly mill accident, a boiler failure, a fast-moving fire. Several workers killed before rescue reached the lower level. One name in the article was Bridget O'Malley, aged 28, widowed, Irish-born, 1 daughter left behind. That line was tiny in the column, nearly swallowed by the larger story of machinery damage and production losses, which tells you everything you need to know about the era. Even in tragedy, workers were often treated like afterthoughts. But Amelia stared at that small mention for a long time. A widowed mill worker dies in a fire, leaves behind a young daughter, no relatives listed. The timing fit. The girl in the portrait looked to be about 5, maybe 6. The dates lined up almost too well. She spent the next 2 days chasing Bridget O'Malley through newspapers, parish records, and neighbourhood lists. Her husband had died of illness a year earlier. They had no close family left in New England. Bridget worked the dawn shift, which explained why the child hadn't been at the mill the day of the fire. After the accident, neighbours reportedly cared for the girl short-term, but then the record went thin. That kind of vanishing can mean many things in old archives: an orphanage, a relative, illness, death, informal placement, reinvention. Amelia checked the orphanage ledgers first. Nothing. No matching girl admitted under Bridget's surname. She checked church charity rolls. One small entry mentioned funds quietly collected for the child of the deceased O'Malley woman, but there was no next step attached, just a phrase hanging there, unfinished. And that's when the obvious possibility finally stopped being just a theory. Someone had taken the child in privately, someone connected to the mill fire, someone with enough means to feed another mouth and enough tenderness to let a little girl bring one worn doll from one life into another. Amelia went back to the portrait and looked at it differently now. The little girl stood close to Clara Bennett, held in place by the subtle kind of contact women used in those stiff old portraits when they wanted to reassure a child without ruining the composition. The doll wasn't in the girl's hands, which would have made it too obvious. It was beside the chair instead, almost hidden, almost secret, but not erased. That choice mattered. It felt like the Bennetts were saying 2 things at once. She is with us now, and she came from somewhere before us. That sort of honesty, quiet as it was, hit Amelia hard. She still needed proof, though, not just a beautiful theory. So she turned to school registers. Those records can be more revealing than birth ledgers because schools cared less about bloodlines and more about whether a child was in a seat on Monday morning. In the enrollment book for a primary school near the Bennett's address, she found it. Samuel Bennett, Edwin Bennett, Nora Bennett. Nora Bennett appeared in 1891 with no earlier trace in the household and no supporting birth record connecting her to Henry or Clara. She had simply entered the family on paper the same year Bridget O'Malley disappeared from it forever. That was the hinge. From there, the rest of the story started unfolding in that slow, emotional way these investigations sometimes do. Not like a detective movie, more like a locked room opening a few inches at a time. At the local historical society in Pawtucket, Amelia found oral history transcripts recorded in the 1970s. Most were full of the usual neighborhood memories: wages, strikes, weather, church socials, funerals, who lived where, who drank too much, who never did. Then, in one interview with an elderly woman recalling Cedar Lane families from her childhood, she found the line that made the whole thing settle into place. The Bennetts had 2 boys and a little girl, she said. Everyone knew the girl was not theirs by birth, but nobody said it cruelly. Mrs. Bennett took the poor thing in after her mother was lost in the mill fire, raised her right alongside the boys, loved her no differently. That was it. No scandal, no melodrama, just neighborhood memory doing what official records had failed to do. Amelia sat with that transcript for a long time because this is the part people miss when they talk about the past, as if it were made only of laws and headlines. So much of history survives because ordinary people remember what mattered, even when institutions don't. The 1900 census still showed her in the Bennett home, listed simply as daughter. By 1910, she was a young woman working as a seamstress. In 1912, she married a machinist named Daniel Pierce. On the marriage certificate, her father's name was written as Henry Bennett. No hint of Bridget, no note of orphaning, no official correction. The 1900 census still showed her in the Bennett home, listed simply as daughter. By 1910, she was a young woman working as a seamstress. In 1912, she married a machinist named Daniel Pierce. On the marriage certificate, her father's name was written as Henry Bennett. No hint of Bridget, no note of orphaning, no official correction. The Bennetts had not just sheltered her, they had given her a full life inside their own name. Amelia found Nora again in city directories, census rolls, and eventually in a death certificate from the 1960s. She had children, grandchildren. She had outlived the tragedy that could have broken her entire future before it began. And the thing that kept catching in Amelia's throat was how ordinary that later life looked. Marriage, work, family, addresses, the paper trail of somebody allowed to continue. That's what kindness does sometimes. It doesn't make headlines. It just changes the rest of a life so thoroughly that later generations don't even realize the cliff their family once stood beside. Then Amelia made contact with a granddaughter. Her name was Eleanor Price, and she arrived at the archive carrying a flat portfolio and the kind of careful expression people wear when they know they may be about to hear something that rearranges old stories. Amelia showed her the portrait first. Eleanor recognized it immediately from a smaller copy that had hung in a hallway when she was young. She had never noticed the doll. Then Amelia told her everything. The fire, Bridget O'Malley, the missing records, the school register, the oral history, the timeline, the little girl with no birth entry and a doll placed in the portrait like a breadcrumb, left for someone patient enough to follow it. Eleanor sat very still through most of it. Then she opened her portfolio and took out a small object wrapped in tissue. It was the doll. Same yarn hair, same handmade dress, same little repair seam, same awkward shape. Amelia actually stopped breathing for a second. Eleanor said her grandmother Nora had kept the doll her entire life. As a child, she had once asked about it and was told only that it belonged to the first person who loved me. Nothing more. No names, no explanation. Just that one sentence, which now felt so painfully clear that both women sat in silence for a moment after it landed. The doll connected the two mothers, Bridget, who likely made it, and Clara Bennett, who let Nora keep it. That's the kind of detail that breaks you a little, because the portrait suddenly stopped being a mystery about hidden lineage and became something gentler and sadder at the same time. The doll wasn't a clue planted by accident. It was a quiet act of respect. The Bennetts had included Nora fully in their family portrait, but they had also left room, just a little room, for the life she came from. Not enough to mark her as separate, just enough to remember. Amelia later presented the full findings to Nora's descendants in Eleanor's living room. There were grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a few people who had driven in from neighboring towns, and one teenager who looked at the enlarged portrait on the screen and whispered that Nora looked scared. Maybe she did. Or maybe she just looked like children always looked in those old studio photographs, overdressed, overpositioned, and told not to move. But once you know what a child has survived, every expression starts to feel heavier. They passed the doll around carefully. Nobody spoke much at first. Then the stories started. How Nora never wasted food. How she always stopped for children in distress. How she sewed beautifully. How Nora never wasted food. How she always stopped for children in distress. How she sewed beautifully. How she kept that doll in a drawer wrapped in cloth and never let it be thrown away. One man, Nora's great-grandson, said quietly that his whole family existed because somebody in 1890 chose not to let a little girl disappear. That was the cleanest summary of the entire case. Not a political speech, not a grand public gesture, just a choice inside a moment of disaster. Take her in, raise her, let her keep the doll, put her in the portrait, and let the smallest clue on the floor say the rest. A few months later, the archive mounted a small exhibit pairing the portrait with a photograph of the doll. Amelia gave it a title simple enough to carry the weight without showing off. Beside the chair, families came through, students, older couples, local history people who always leaned too close to glass, and almost everybody had the same reaction. They looked at the family first, then the doll, then back at the family again, and you could see the understanding arrive. This wasn't a story about scandal. It was a story about mercy. The little girl in the portrait had once been the daughter of a widowed mill worker who died in fire and smoke before sunrise. She could have vanished into institutional records, or into none at all. Instead, she was folded into a household that gave her a surname, brothers, schooling, a wedding record, grandchildren, and the ordinary dignity of being claimed. And somehow, through all those years, the doll survived too. Barely visible beside a chair in 1891, still speaking in the present. That's what I keep coming back to. The doll wasn't hidden because the Bennets were ashamed. It was placed carefully because they were trying to do two hard things at once. Tell the truth. Protect the child. In one small decision, they preserved both. She belonged here now, and she had been loved before. Not many photographs can hold that much, but this one did. So now when people look at that old portrait, they don't just see a respectable New England family with solemn faces and good clothes. They see a child carried from one life into another. They see grief, kindness, and memory all sitting in the same frame. And they see how the smallest detail in an image can hold the largest truth. Because sometimes history does not hide in the center of the photograph. Sometimes it waits quietly near the floor, beside the chair, until somebody finally knows how to look.